Hi, Nigel. Hi, everybody. Lovely to be with you again. And yeah, what's new on VHF? Well, let's do the technical stuff first of all, and just see if I can share my screen. What's new at VHF and above? Well, I guess when I spoke to Evan about what I should talk about this time, he said, "Oh, how could you do something about what's new at VHF?" And I thought, actually, that's really difficult. Because, first of all, what do you mean by new? And a surprising amount of stuff isn't new. I was asked for, I think, the 90th anniversary issue of Practical Wireless to do something reflecting 90 years of VHF and UHF. And actually, it was one of the most interesting columns that I've had to research and write. And what really amazed me was the amount of cool stuff that was going on in sort of the 1940s and 1950s on bands that you wouldn't expect. Things like 77s and 23, and people using sort of huge collinear arrays and on wooden towers and so on. It was absolutely amazing, and they were having some really good contacts as well. Bear in mind this was CW or it was AM. And it was really interesting, and we're obviously doing good stuff on those bands now as well ourselves. But it amazed me what was done quite early on. Anyway, I digress really. Well, what sort of things might we consider as new? And I started to write down the things that I thought we might regard as new. On VHF and UHF at the moment. I probably missed loads out actually, but these were just some thoughts. Narrowband digital modes, FT8 and Q65, and all that stuff. SDR, of course. Microwaves are so much more accessible now, I think, than they've ever been before. Hotspots and all the digital voice stuff. Analog hotspots and All-Star and Echolink and all those things. I suppose Echolink's been around quite a while. Those technologies have got a lot more pervasive. New on VHF, or comparatively new, SOTA, I suppose, that generates quite a lot of activity around here. Internet linking. M17, that's a new digital voice mode, so that's up and coming. Then on satellites, there's Green Cube, which is out in a middle Earth orbit, and that has great coverage across the globe for satellite operators. It's a data type satellite, so that's quite an interesting one. One from the same company, S5 Labs, I think it is LED sat, LED sat, and that's in a low Earth orbit, but the same sort of technology. So it's sort of a bit packet-like, if you like, or messenger-like. So you have a terminal screen and type messages at each other. It's looks quite fun. I haven't tried it yet. QO100, which I know a number of you know all about. So that's quite fun. Digital TV, that's again comparatively new. Something I've written down as hackability, and we'll come to that a little bit later, but I suppose it's all about misusing equipment to our own ends and making it do what we'd like it to do rather than what the manufacturer originally intended. And then there's internet tools like PSK Reporter and Reverse Beacon Network, which tell us where our signals are being heard. PSK Reporter, bit of a misnomer. It works with all the data modes, not PSK, well, not just PSK, but FT8 and so on. So of course you can just transmit your call, and if you're being heard somewhere, then PSK Reporter will hear you. And of course the same sort of thing on CW, the Reverse Beacon Network, which is brilliant. You call CQ on the key a few times and see where you're being heard. So and that works on the VHF bands as well as HF. So those were a few things I thought about what's new. Well, obviously, we're not going to talk about all of those this evening. You'll be quite relieved to know, I think. But I thought it might also be interesting to think about what's changed, what's changed in the whole sort of sphere of VHF and UHF. And I think, everybody would accept that activity has sort of changed as, and operating habits have changed. And, if we look back, if you've been licensed a good few years, you'll probably recognise that there's less voice and less CW and more data on the VHF bands. And, lots of people are unhappy about that and so on. But that's not just a trend in amateur radio. I think that's life in general. I'm certainly one of those people that makes fewer phone calls and sends a lot more messages. And if you get a phone call without somebody messaging you first, it's a bit odd, isn't it? So I think that's a sort of general trend, and I think that by and large people like to sort of know who they're talking to first, which is interesting. And then I think the whole sort of weekend contests, when many of us started, I think the sort of VHF contests that started on a Saturday afternoon and ran through to a Sunday afternoon, along with the HF contests, of course, they were a really big thing, but those are much less well supported these days. And of course, you get the weekday activity contests. And as a friend of mine was saying, the only trouble is that the activity contests are sometimes the only time that there's activity, and people think that they don't need to be on at other times, which is a bit of a shame. And lots of people say, "Oh, there's no activity on VHF, UHF," and I think that's not true. I think that what we are seeing is that there are many more diverse activities. So there's lots of people at any one time, perhaps on FT8, people playing satellite, people playing data modes and so on. Sorry, voice data, so D-Star, DMR, all those sorts of things. And any of those things you would probably miss if you did a quick scan across 2 meters. So I think that's an interesting challenge for us, and I think we have to be cognizant of that. And I think it's very valuable for people like yourselves, for clubs like yourselves, to have a 2 meter FM net. Otherwise, it's easy for people to think, both people who might be casually listening and people like Ofcom to be listening and think, there's no activity there. I won't bother with VHF, or in Ofcom's case, I won't worry about reallocating the band. So I think it's really important that we make our presence known. I was thinking about equipment, and one of the things we see now is there are fewer single band VHF or UHF multi-mode transceivers. When I started playing on VHF, there were things like the Icon 251s and the 271s and the ASU FT225s, all that sort of stuff. But of course, you can't get those transceivers now, and they tend to be sort of multi-bands, like the IC 9700 or something like the FT991A. So that's quite interesting. Digital modes on voice and data provide lots of possibilities. But I think, one of the things I really wanted to say, it's never been cheaper to get on the air in some shape or form, which I think is absolutely wonderful. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. Internet, linking gives us all sorts of possibility and all sorts of great tools. And I'm sure, as we've been going through some of the things on that slide, some of you are thinking, yeah, it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? But I think it's really important that we don't spend a lot of time saying, oh yeah, it used to be so much better years ago, and that's pointless, isn't it? I think we just have to roll with the changes and get on and do something that we enjoy doing, maybe learn something new or try new stuff. And I remember saying to a friend, if the hobby stays the same, then we're really in trouble because we're not moving forward. And I think that's really important to remember. Anyway, So getting on to what I was probably asked to talk about. So I tried to pick a few new things to talk about. So I thought the first thing that I wanted to put in front of you was SDR, kind of in general, but we'll start off with receivers, and because I think SDR receivers, change everything. and if you played with it, you'll kind of know what I mean. But the really fantastic thing is if you haven't played with an SDR receiver, then you can do so for next to no money. If you start off with an SDR dongle, which is repurposed from a TV stick, I think it gives you coverage of about 25 to 1750 megahertz, somewhere around there, and that will set you back about £10. Which is amazing, and you'd be surprised if you connect it to a decent aerial, then they're not bad at all. You can receive satellites with them, and in fact, I had a lovely contact 18 months ago with a guy in Cuba on the RS-44 satellite, and I was very pleased to work Cuba, and he was surprisingly quite pleased to work Wales as well. And his gear, he had a converted taxi transmitter, an FM transmitter that he'd converted so that he could send CW on it, which was brilliant. And he used one of these RTL SDR dongles to receive, connected up to, can't remember what receive antenna he had. I think it might have been a vertical or something like that, and it worked surprisingly well. So that was fun. So it's it's nice. So it's good enough to make satellite contacts and to hear satellites well. You can use them for ADS-B reception, so receiving aircraft data, position data, where they are. Even on the sort of tiny little stick antenna that comes with the RTL SDR, you probably receive aircraft out sort of 50 to 100 miles quite easily. You can use them for receiving ships AIS. Good thing over here, maybe less so with you, I don't know. And then you get into all the slightly random stuff that you can receive using data. Tire pressure monitors on cars. The cars are broadcasting on generally on 433 megs in the unlicensed band, or 868 megs perhaps, about what tire pressures your car's got. Some oil tanks have meters on them that showing the level. Have I run out of oil yet? And you can receive all this stuff on a RTL SDR dongle, and there's software to decode all this data, or listen to a satellite or VHF, UHF generally. And the software's available for all the operating systems that you probably would be running. So obviously at a cost of about £10, they're not brilliant receivers, but they're actually great to get you going. And if you haven't played with one, then I'd really recommend that you give it a go. As I've said, the filtering isn't brilliant, so it's not going to be great on 28 meg CW or something like that. You're going to be hearing quite a few signals at once, but for most of the stuff you're going to want to be doing at VHF, UHF, that's not a huge problem. Typically once you've played with an SDR receiver like that, you think, well, maybe I should try a better one. And the next sort of price point comes in at about £100. And they give you a bit more sensitivity, more filtering, perhaps a wider frequency range, probably going down more as opposed to going higher than 1750 megs, although I think probably most of them go up to sort of 2 and a bit gigs. But they'll go down to VLF and so on as well. And different manufacturers available. SDR Play have some nice models. AirSpy, there's a FunCube dongle around. They all start at about £100 or so, and you can run those with various bits of software, many of which I guess you're probably familiar with. SDR Sharp, I think that's run mostly by the AirSpy guys these days. SDR Console, nice bit of kit. SDR Uno from SDR Play, and they've got a new bit of software out now called SDR Connect. That's just appeared in the last week or so, and that's exciting if you run Linux or Mac OS or something like that, because up to now SDR Uno only works on Windows, but SDR Connect works on Unix. You can run it on a Raspberry Pi, you can run it on a MacBook or a Macintosh. So that's quite interesting. So SDR Connect's only in its infancy, but the preview release they put up a week or so ago is very slick, very smart. I haven't broken it yet, so full marks to them for that. And it looks like they've got lots of plans of new features to bring into it. So that's kind of fun. Spark SDR is one I came across recently, and I find that quite useful if you're interested in decoding data like FT8, FT4, or whatever, rather than having to use a virtual audio cable. Spark SDR decodes that data natively and so on. So that might be one to have a play with if you haven't seen it before. SDR Angel is an interesting bit of SDR software, quite complicated, but you can do all sorts of very cool things with it if you spend a bit of time with it, including television and ADS-B, all those sorts of things. So that might be something fun to play with. And again, that works for Windows and Linux. So SDR receivers, I think amazing to have in the shack. It's a great extra receiver. I've got running here all the time, but you can just use it for listening to something that catches your interest, rather than tying up a transceiver. But of course you can also use it as a spectrum analyzer, checking out your signals. I quite often use it if I get a new cheapy handheld in. What do the harmonics look like? What do the sprockets look like? So that they're great for that sort of thing. As well as receivers, of course, you can get transceivers, SDR transceivers as well. Obviously, you can get the sort of fully fledged SDR transceivers like Flex radios and so on, and they're amazing. I'm not particularly going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about much cheaper things that you could perhaps play with a little bit more readily. And there's a variety of boards which provide transceiver capability at a few milliwatts here or there, 1 to 3 milliwatts perhaps. Things like the Lime SDR board. Lime have got a few boards out which do this sort of thing. The Etus, add-on Pluto, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a while. But it's surprising what you can do with these things, and although it's just a few milliwatts, it's surprising how far some of this stuff can go. Bear in mind, if you do want to start sort of feeding these signals into amplifiers or whatever, it's worth doing some filtering. Otherwise, it all gets a bit nasty. And the same sort of software is available. SDR Console, SDR Angel, both have transmit capabilities within them. So yeah, a little bit about transceivers. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about something I've been playing with recently. I was fascinated by the idea of being able to play on microwaves with one of these little units. I went over to a friend's house in Cheltenham, and he had a very simple aerial, a PCB antenna, and it was a Lime SDR board actually, and he was receiving a beacon from Cheltenham up in Shropshire on 2.3 and 3.4 gigs, and I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. So of course I wanted to try that for myself, and I ended up with the add-on Pluto unit, which is it's marketed as a SDR learning tool, and I think as it comes, I can't quite remember what the frequency coverage is, but you can do a mod to it, and it's not a hardware mod, it's a software thing. So you just open up a terminal and tap some commands to it, and that enables it to operate anywhere between 70 megahertz and 6 gigahertz, which is quite mind blowing. So all those amateur bands you can see there, you've got a little bit of power on 70 megs, 144 megs, 432, 1296, 2.3, 3.4, and 5.7 gigs. So that's pretty amazing. And it's a tidy receiver. When it first arrived, I put it in the shack. I put it on the I think it was a 2-meter vertical or something like that. Excuse me, just to see what I could hear, and it was surprisingly sensitive. So I could see the 2-meter repeaters across the RSC. No great surprise because they're fairly strong here. Same on 70 SEMS, and on 2 meters it was great for receiving satellites and so on. So perfectly sensitive. But given where I am, there aren't many microwave beacons around here. So recently, when I was over in Cheltenham for a week, I tried repeating the tests that we did at John GHCQX's place, and I was really pleased to be able to hear the GB3ZME beacons up in Shropshire on 2.3 and 3.4 gigs. They were quite decent signals. We did listen on 5.7 gigs as well, but we didn't hear anything. And in the picture on the bottom right of the screen, you can see a sort of PCB type antenna, and that's what we use to receive the 2.3 and 3.4 gig signals. We had a window which was facing up to the north and fairly clear in that direction, but even so, it gives you an idea that you can play around with quite small antennas. You can do with the add-on Pluto. You can do digital TV. It's not something I've played with yet, but my friend Graham G3VKV uses a Pluto on DATV, and that works quite well. And I was thinking as I was typing this stuff up, you've got a fair amount of 23 SEMS FM activity around you. I think there's a net in the Manchester area. I know Steve G4AQB is involved, and perhaps some of you may be as well. But now I thought if you had one of these boards, you'd at least be able to hear some of that activity. The PCB antenna that you see on the picture was a homebrew one, not by me, but by John GHCQX. He designed that and thought that should work. But you can also find I think it's Kent WA5VJB has I think he sells some PCB type antennas, but possibly you can find some designs for them as well. There's also something called the Vivaldi aerial, which is a wideband aerial, I think from probably about 500 megs up to, I'm going to say 3.5 gigs. Not absolutely sure of that. But you can find those. There's a site called Tindy, not Tinder, Tindy, and you can obtain those on there, or you could potentially find an aerial design for a Vivaldi antenna as well. So That's quite fun. And yeah, last line there could be something like a Pluto could be the basis for a QO100 station. You'd obviously uplink on 13 SEMS. You'd need to amplify a little bit, and you could also use the receiver, feed your LNB into the Pluto, and I think it's about 600 megs or something like that. The downlink appears, so you could do a lot of it on QO. Use one of those for QO 100 if you wanted to. Anyway, that was really just you might have some fun on microwaves using a fairly cheap sort of unit there. And I certainly enjoyed doing that. Other cool things you can do with SDR receivers, and I think this is something I've only sort of fairly recently got my head round, but you can use the receivers to monitor several slices of the band at the time. So with one receiver, one aerial, you can actually tell the SDR software to listen to, say, 3 different parts of the band. So you could, for example, you could have one virtual receiver monitoring FT8 and decoding that. You could have another virtual receiver looking at the 2 meter FM segment, looking at when activity appears and so on, and perhaps another virtual receiver looking at the satellite bands and showing when signals are coming through when a satellite comes up. So that's really quite nice, and you could add another one to monitor 2 meters CW, whatever you like. I use a similar thing on 10 meters, and I'm using Spark SDR. I have a SDR receiver connected to a receiving loop actually in the shack, and I monitor FT8, FT4, and Whisper, 3 different virtual receivers running on the software, and the software just decodes that information and uploads it to PSK Reporter, which we find quite interesting and gives me a sort of day-to-day feeling of what's going on 10 meters. But you could do that on 6 meters, for example, if you wanted to. And the world's your oyster with this stuff. If you've got a really powerful computer, then you could potentially monitor other bands as well. So, for example, you could add perhaps the 437 megahertz CubeSat band into that, so you could see all the different CubeSats coming over the horizon and watch that. And of course, it's very interesting when you get launches, satellite launches of actually picking up the new CubeSats and seeing what they're doing and trying to decode the signals. So you can do all that stuff with an SDR very, very easily. And one of the absolutely fantastic things about SDR is that it allows you to record the whole of the band at once for later decoding. So, if you grew up in an amateur radio sense in the 1980s, like I did, and you were interested in single sideband meteor scatter, why did we do that to ourselves? But we did, and of course, what you had to do is when you heard a ping or a burst, you thought, oh, what did I hear there? Well, of course, with SDR, you can record, say, the whole of the 2 meter bands actually at the same time, and you can listen to it for later decoding. So, for example, if there's a 2 meter sporadic E opening going on, you could record the whole of the band where you are. And at the end of the opening, switch the recording off, and then you can actually go through. So you can go through the sideband end, the FT8 end. You can analyze those independently. You can go up to the FM end. Who appeared, how many Moroccans appeared on S20? Yeah, it really does happen. And see what you you heard, if you like. It's quite interesting. Make sure you have plenty of disk space, though. It does chew up the disk space, and yeah, you do have to listen to it, though. I was listening to a podcast which is aimed at FMDXs, you know, the band 288 to 108 megs. I was listening to that at the weekend, and you know, they were very enthusiastic about SDR and what they can do in openings. But it sounded like it really was a thing that, you know, many DXs sort of record all these sporadic key openings and never quite get around to listening to them. It's like, you know, that stack of recordings on your digital TV recorder. You might you don't always get around to watching all those programs, do you? So maybe you do, but I think it's easy to, you know, record lots of data and then not have the time to sort of go through and analyze it. And I think it's interesting that they were actually talking about some software which actually goes through those and sort of highlights interesting things, which I thought was fascinating. So we might be seeing some more of that. So, you know, I think that's really good for propagation research, and we'll touch on that in a little while. Yeah, I thought one of the other things I wanted to talk about was hackability. Well, what do I mean by that? It's a word I came up with myself, I'm afraid. But lots of clever people have been adapting firmware or perhaps misusing it to do things which are useful to us as radio enthusiasts. We've already talked about one of those, the RTL SDR dongles. Of course, they started off being TV sticks, and then some clever people came along and said, well, actually we can, you know, make the coverage a lot greater, and we can, you know, feed that, we can provide some drivers so that your PC can address it as a device, not just for TV reception, but as a radio receiver as well. So that was fabulous. And then we had things like perhaps some of you have come across the I think it's Titera, isn't it? MD380. It's a DMR handheld, very competent single band, 2 meter or 70 sems DMR handheld, been around for a while now, and it had a fairly basic sort of DMR functionality, primarily aimed at sort of commercial type users, which doesn't translate brilliantly into amateur use. So somebody came along and wrote MD380 tools. There's a few different forks of that now, and that's different firmware which you can load back into the MD380, which makes it a lot more suitable for amateur use. The Radio Odyssey GD77 was a very similar device. It was a very cheap DMR radio at one point. I'm sure you could get them for about £30 or £40, and I suspect you can't get them anymore. Anyway, there was a wonderful project called Open GD77, which was sort of put together by a guy, Jason, I can't remember his call, VK7 something or other. Poor chap died very prematurely, but the project has continued, and they've come up with, again, some new firmware which makes the GD77 a lot better as a DMR handset. But they've also built things into it like satellite predictions. You know, when's SO50 going to be overhead, and it tells you where to point the beam and so on, which is it's quite mind blowing, really. My latest favourite actually is the Quansheng UV-K5. It's a 2 meter 70 sems handheld, and you pay between £9 on AliExpress or £30 from somewhere else, and most of the prices are somewhere in between. And you know, it's designed as a 2 meter 70 sems handheld, and some clever people have put some hacked firmware together, and it extends the coverage quite dramatically. I think it's supposed to be between 18 and 1300 megahertz, and I think the top end is a bit of a bold claim. I certainly haven't managed to make it work on receive on 23 at the moment. It might transmit a little bit of power, but only a tiny little bit of power on 23. So don't get too excited about it. But it certainly receives all right on 29 megs, 27 megs as well. Actually, you can tune across the CB band and receive FM on there with not with a rubber duck antenna, but with an HF type antenna, and that looks okay. I haven't tested it fully on 6 meters, but it would appear there's probably about 3 watts out. I don't think the spectrum's too horrible, but as I say, I haven't tested that properly so far. On 4 meters, it's not bad at all. About 4 watts output. The sprockets don't look too bad. Clearly, the rubber duck antenna that comes with it is not going to work very well on 4 meters. But if you stick, another 4 meter type whip on it, it looks like it'll work okay on 4 meters, and certainly the receiver's pretty decent. And I've done a couple of tests on transmit, so actually that's quite a cheap way of getting on 4 meters FM, which might appeal to you. Yeah, it has got some AM capability, so you can listen to the airband. I think they fiddle it somehow, so the AM sounds horrible, but it is better than nothing, I suppose. So you can listen to aircraft, but it's not that great. And I think you can extend I haven't tried this yet. I think you can potentially extend the AM coverage to other bands. Well, that's actually, I have tried it on 11 meters on AM on receive, and it did work kind of okay. It's again, it's not brilliant, but what fantastic value for the money. I've had so much fun playing with this little radio, just trying to make it do different things and testing things out. It's if you pay 20 quid and you get to play with that stuff, I think that's quite fun. So yeah, that's my hackability example for you at the moment. Well, I think we're kind of doing okay for time. I want to say very quickly, I think one of the other things that's new for us at VHF, HF as well actually, is a much greater understanding of propagation, and because we're able to use weaker and weaker signals as a result of the digital modes like FT8 and Q65, then we're learning about different paths, which I think 20 years ago we didn't have much of a sense of. And something that I've noticed is a path on 6 meters around lunchtime, so maybe a little bit before, which by and large equates to sunrise, say in North America, and the band opens for a little while and then generally closes again, and that happens pretty frequently. In the sort of height of the season, it probably happens on 3 or 4 days out of 7, maybe a little more often. Whereas 20 years ago, we didn't know about the path. We knew it happened sometimes at that time of day, but maybe we spotted an opening couple of times a month, three or 4 times a month at that time. So it's really interesting looking at different paths and finding out what's possible. And this is true on HF as well. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter or X, as it's regrettably been renamed, but CT1BOH, who's a big HF DXer, which he often looks at quite interesting openings using this sort of information and reverse beacon network as well. So I think we're getting a lot more understanding of what propagation does across the spectrum. So for me, that's a really exciting thing. I wanted to throw in a little bit about internet linking and so on. I suppose many of you will perhaps have heard of digital hotspots, so you can use a hotspot with your DMR radio or your D-Star radio. But of course, there are analog hotspots as well. Same sort of technology. So you could probably cobble one together for yourself, perhaps on low power on 70 SEMS. You could maybe use one of the cheap Baofeng transceivers or something like that, a sound card, a Raspberry Pi, and an internet connection. And then you speak through that using another handheld on also on 70 SEMS. And you can connect I've shown the control panel of an all-star node here, and that allows you to connect to other all-star nodes or Echo-Link nodes or other systems. There's a system called the Papa repeater network on the west coast of the States that you can connect to, for example, and listen to the commuter hour in LA or somewhere like that on a cheap handheld, and that's really good fun to do. So you can build your own using those sort of components. I think it's fairly well documented as how to do that, but you can or you can buy a semi-commercial micro hub. Peter G7RPG puts the micro hub together, and that's a fabulous little unit. And these are great little things for keeping in touch. And it's a bit like digital hotspots. You can have some really nice QSOs with very simple equipment, with people that you perhaps wouldn't speak to otherwise. So, for example, my analog hotspot, I can echo link into one of the repeaters where I used to live in Oxfordshire and have some conversations. I'm sure there's an Echo Link node somewhere around Stockport, so I can probably connect up and have a chat with you guys as well. So so that's quite interesting. And I gave a talk to another group a little while ago, and some said, well, why might you play around with hotspots or something like that? And I think it's quite interesting to get these things going as well. But I suppose something for us to think about, that at some point, hopefully many years into the future, we may have to move somewhere where we're not able to put up antennas, or we're not able to look after the antennas or whatever. And I'd like to think that we'll still be interested in radio, we'll still be interested in the outside world and talking to people in some way, or maybe even just listening to people, and these hotspots will allow us to do things like that. So I think that's quite valuable in that respect. So there we are. I think that's. Have I come up with things that were new on VHF, UHF? I'm not sure. Maybe some of the things weren't totally new, but perhaps they might give you some ideas of things that you could play with. And I think that's the really important thing. For me, amateur radio is a brilliant hobby. It's kept me interested for I don't know too many years really. But I think it's so varied. There's so many different things that you can play around with, and I think that's for me what keeps the excitement going. So I hope that was something interesting for you in all of that. But keep tinkering, keep playing with the stuff, and have fun. See you on the air.
That was excellent, that, Tim, because certainly highlighted quite a few things that I'd not thought about. I know SDRs are particularly popular at the moment, as are the various other modes, etc., that we've been looking at. I mean, certainly our previous talk by Carsten was an interesting one, because he was talking obviously about meteor scatter, and to some extent the two things are interlinked, are they not? Evan, I wonder if there's any questions perhaps you want to pose.
Yeah, I was just wondering if if people, and this is probably one for Peter BCG as well, just since these new transceivers like the FT8991, particularly FT9700 and the IC705, I mean, has there been an increase, a noticeable increase in VHF activity generally, you know, like on sideband or CW? I mean, I think CW is pretty quiet, but
well, I think there's been an increase in activity. Peter, hi, nice to see you. Let you have a go at this one. I think there's more activity now on VHF than there has been in quite a while, as a result of VHF, of FT8 and data modes and so on. Is there more activity on sidebands? Maybe in the activity contests. Outside of that, probably not. So yeah, I think, you know, those rigs have been very positive, and they're certainly quite interesting to play with. So I think there is more activity. I think there's probably as much activity as in parts of the 1980s and 1990s, but it's just, as I said in that slide, it's taken a different. You know, it's taken a different shape. Peter, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, going back to Evan's basic question about the 705 and, well, the 9700 is a bit expensive, but certainly I think the 705 has had the same effect that another ICOM rig did back in the day, and that was the ICOM 706, which transformed everything because it was a small shack in a box. You know, it did top band to 70 centimeters, and it was reasonably priced, and it came out in 3 iterations and a low power version from Japan, and that put a massive boost on activity. And certainly even to this day, it's the radio that I used the most. I haven't got one now, I sold it and I'm regretting it, but it certainly got used in every situation. Getting back onto what people work and what have you, yeah, sadly, the SSB activity doesn't pick up that much. Likewise, CW. I've not been as active this year for various reasons. I still work massively more on FT8 and FT4 for that matter than I do on SSB or CW, because when the band's not open, there are people trying all kinds of things. If you're interested in working DX, I'm talking 6 meters here, but it's true for 2 meters, true for 77s. It's also true for the HF bands. And it's, you know, it's a magnet, isn't it, really? That's the problem, that if you're calling CQ on CW or on SSB, and suddenly somebody reports something down the band or up the band on 6 meters on FT8 that's 5-10 times further away than what you're working. If you're interested in DX, you'll be on FT8. It's a fact. It's transformed the band, as Tim was saying. It's transformed all bands. Putting those two things together, though, I think there's a tremendous amount of activity using the low power rigs such as the 705 and using digital modes. And certainly from our very small club down here, the Callington Amateur Radio Society, where there are a few people new to radio and new to HF particularly, and they're having amazing QSOs on low power on FT8 and really being very happy about it. They're also playing on SSB, but, you know, like it or not, FT8 delivers, and it's a step change similar to that moving from AM to SSB did in the late 50s. And I remember the tail end of that with lots of people in Stockport Club, for that matter, saying, oh, I don't know, this SSB, this Donald Duck stuff can't be proper radio. It doesn't have a carrier. How can it be proper radio? Well, here we go again with FT8. That's my 2 cents.
Agree.
Yeah, I think it's one of those Marmite stories, isn't it? At the end of the day, you know, people love it or hate it, but it is a means of communication. And I think FT8 and FT4 have still got their place or have their place. And one of the members who's not with us tonight is Stephen SUG, who's using that on HF. Although I don't think he's at this point in time migrated to the VHF bands to give them a try. But I think Carsten, I think you've tried FT8 and FT4, etc., on the VHF bands to great success, have you not?
Yeah, like Peter on 6 meters, most of the traffic is now on FT8, even though luckily yesterday I could move the 3B9 to CW and had a good contact for a new DXCC in CW. I'm still struggling to get to the 100, but that was a new
Very
one.
nice, well done.
Yeah, congratulations on that. On CW as well.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I've worked in before on FT8, of course, but yeah, this time it was right when he moved to CW, so that was good.
Where was that? Is that Reunion or something? Is it?
It's Rodriguez Island, isn't it?
Yeah,
Rodriguez.
Yeah, he is.
A place you'll know well too.
I know the operator, Robert. Yes, lovely guy.
Yeah, and he's been incredibly active this year. He's really found 6 meters this year, and he's there. He seems to be there all of the time, because I've had him call me on several occasions out of the blue, which is something to say here. On VHF, and particularly on 6 meters, if the band sounds dead, don't change band, call CQ.
Yeah.
And you may get a surprise. Quite often it sounds dead. That's because everybody's listening. Nobody's transmitting. Call CQ.
That's another thing, I guess, that's changed with PSK Reporter, that you just give out a few calls and then you know
Yes.
if it's open or not.
Absolutely.
If it looks interesting, you keep calling, don't you?
But that's another thing. That's another thing to add to the things that's changed, really, isn't it? Because you've got so many websites now, such as PSK Reporter, the the Reverse Beacon Network, etc., that I suppose it's taken over from the old DX cluster, and that it's so easy to see what's about.
Yeah, they're complementary in many ways, and beacons still have their value, but certainly PSK Reporter for Digimodes is incredible, because whether it's testing antennas or testing propagation, you just put out a CQ and hopefully watch the map light up.
Yes.
And then you can end up spinning the beam in all directions, because you point east and you get a spot from the west, and you point west and you get a spot from the east. But as we're speaking, I don't know whether you can hear a whistling in the background. My linears are getting a bit warm in here, because I'm actually on 40 meters FT8 and have been for the last hour or so. Just churning away, watching the screen and clicking every now and then. So there's lots to be worked.
It just shows a different way of working, though, doesn't it? At the end of the day, you can sit there. All right, it might be computer to computer, but at the end of the day, you're still having to use the the RF to get the signal across.
Yeah, and it's still point and shoot if you want. I'm watching the call sign scrolling by, and if anything new comes up, I'm on it.
Okay, is there anybody else like to ask any questions?
Can I just say, Tim, what do you think about additional modes? Is this more going to be warning, as you might say, introductions to younger people to be using amateur radio?
I think as Peter was describing, I think it's great for foundation licensees, because they can, if you come in with 10 watts and you're trying to work people on sideband, you certainly will work some people with sideband, but it's going to be hard going, and I think it probably has put some people off. Whereas if you're able to run 10 watts of FT8 or something like that, as Peter was saying, you can still work some quite surprising stuff. So I think it's very positive for newcomers. Particularly as I think a lot of younger people, are we getting younger people into the hobby? Well, that's an interesting question. What's the demographic of people coming into the hobby? That's a whole new thing. But assuming it was younger people, then they're probably used to messaging and so on and so forth. So that probably sits quite well with them. So yeah, I think it's positive. And there's also a sense of it kind of is as it is. Much as we might wish that people were on AM or something like that, they're not. So you have to go with what there is, and hopefully you'll find that the newcomers will find that interesting, and I think they do.
I think the other side to it as well is that as far as older people are concerned, is when they or start to lose their faculties, should we say, certainly from the hearing side of it, then FT8 and the digital modes make it a lot easier to continue within the hobby, should we say. Certainly there are members out there who struggle with hearing loss and perhaps prefer to be able to click away on a keyboard and watch the contacts come in rather than actually making the SSB contact, or maybe even CW if the fingers are not quite as good as they used to be.
Yeah.
We're careful about that, because when you get older, you tend to hit two keys at the same time on the keyboard.
I still do.
Yeah, the thing about the PSK reporter as well, though, for newcomers, it really is. I've seen people's eyes light up, and also for people who are not radio hams, who are visiting a special event station, for example. And if somebody puts out, you say, right, we're now calling CQ general call, and suddenly the PC screen lights up with a load of lines all over Europe or all over the world or whatever. And you can say, well, look, that's where this signal from this little room is getting to. That's great. The other thing I would say with FT8, and I do wish there was more activity on other modes, but the great thing with low power and foundation licenses on FT8 is pile-ups are totally different. If you're trying to work a DX station on SSB in a 2.4 kilohertz bandwidth, it's you and 1,000 others, and even with split, there's still thousands of people all running more power than you, it may seem. The great thing about FT8 is it's a fabulous leveler. In a single audio passband, you can decode maybe 70 or 80 signals, and they are decoded without regard to their signal strength. And that's the bit of magic, that it's as close to a level playing field as you're ever going to get. As long as you're detectable, you're decoded. It doesn't matter whether you're S9 or S nothing.
Absolutely.
Go on, Evan, as the person who doesn't like FT8, go on.
I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything. But just on that, I mean, coming back to the RBN and PSK reporter, I mean, I am generally interested. Probably, I mean, certainly RBN. It's got to be a digital mode or CW. I just wonder. I mean, how many? Say on 2 meters, how wide is the network of SDRs which are hooked onto the RBN, say in Europe, the UK, or whatever? I mean, is it quite wide? Is it?
Yeah, on 2 meters, well, 6 meters definitely, and 2 meters as well.
Right. I would guess it's thousands of stations, because particularly with PSK reporter, you have to remember that, assuming you've not disconnected it, if you're using FT8, then your station, every CQ it receives, it's reporting to PSK reporter, unless you've disabled it. So anyone who's listening on the band is generating that.
Yeah.
It's not like the reverse beacon network. It's anybody who's active is reporting to the database.
Yeah. As a PSK reporter, that would just cover PSK RTTY and the WSJT modes, is it?
You can leave it open. It covers all data modes basically that are on the software packages that do the auto reporting.
I've been reported on CW as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing actually.
Because CW Skimmer, I think, ports into that as well. So
yeah,
I just assumed it only reported into the RBN.
Yeah, No, it's interesting. You sometimes see your CW signals on PSK reporting, really.
Okay.
It's quite
Well, I didn't know
fun.
that. Yeah, I mean, I guess the you talked about the beacons. I mean, one of the good things about the RBN, anyway, I don't know about PSK reporter, but the fact that it does pick up beacons, automatically, and so like, say if you get some aurora or something like that, or probably more likely tropo or sporadic E, you'll know about it. Certainly with the 10-meter beacons. So that's quite good. And I mean, if that's good, and if there are lots of say 2-meter CW.
No, I was talking about PSK reported. CW, there's not much, no.
Yeah. But with the RBN, I mean, there are a few CW SDRs.
I mean, certainly over in Germany, I occasionally
Certainly.
sort of looking at sort of activity, and you see somebody pop up on 2-meter CW in Germany, and I think the same is true on 6 meters.
Yeah.
So yeah, but then a lot less, I would say, than on data.
Yeah. I mean, I don't like rubbish. Yes, well, I do, but FT8 stuff. But it's not my thing, really. It's
Well, that's fine. Yeah.
Fine, yeah.
But I mean, one of the things that I've always sort of moaned about with the hobby is that with the change in the licensing regime to give everyone the HF privileges, there should have been an emergency sort of session, well, throughout the world of every RSGB type agency, and saying, look, what are we going to do for VHF in terms of things like CW and sideband? How are we going to keep it going? And you just look at the VHFs and that, and they just sort of continue like it's 1985. One change I do recognise though, and I don't think enough people know about it, is there is a thing on Facebook where you can have skeds, not ON4 KST, but just a general sked on CW in the UK. And I don't know exactly what it's called, but you just type 2M/ and then the star or whatever for the wild card, and you'll see it, and you can arrange for skeds on 2 meters and CW. Not enough people know about this sort of stuff. I think that's part of the problem.
I think the other side to it is that a lot of the rigs these days, whilst they've got, they have got 2 and 70 in them, people tend not to graduate up or down to the SSB stroke CW portions of the band. And I think, like Tim said when he kicked off, in the sense that SSB and CW, it tends to be a contest type of thing when you got the backpackers on, or the activity contest, or as somebody said, well, there's activity, but there's only activity when the activity contest is on, it is awkward like that. And I think perhaps talking a little bit wider, in that the CW sessions that David, should we say, is trying to kick off locally, they seem to be having an effect, in the sense that they're attracting operators down to the CW portion of the band. I do remember in years gone by, should we say, our local friend Graham G3ZOD used to shout CQ on 144050 for about half an hour on a Sunday lunchtime, gave up and then disappeared and went and watched Match of the Day or something like that, So
went back to the pub.
But I think what has happened,
Graham.
David's,
I do know Graham
David's
from 50 years ago.
But you mentioned David, M0WDD. I mean, he's got the right idea in that every Sunday at 4 p.m. they're on. There's going to be someone calling CQ. I mean, he's on 144064. I'm on 144060. Now, if that was done, say, countrywide, not necessarily on those frequencies, but Essex CW does it. Whoever else is interested gets on the band, maybe on another frequency. Fisk gets on it on the 144058. You get a critical mass, and people would start operating on either side of that operating hour as well.
Well, I
And
mean,
that's the problem. That this stuff just isn't happening. You've got to do stuff like this.
Well, well, over to you. But I'm not being cheeky or rude, but what I would say is if you look at what some of the FM guys have done, I don't know if you've seen that, but there's Tim G5TM has put together a 145 Alive thing, and in some respects it's based on the idea of nets, like some people will be familiar with from CB. So on a Saturday afternoon, sort of 3 or 4 times a year, people go up onto high ground and make contacts over as wide an area as they can, and they have different nets on different frequencies. And he's run about 4 of them now, and the last one, absolutely masses of activity. It was really fantastic, and there was some really quite good contacts made between the south coast and the north of England on 2 meter FM, which is not bad going. So it probably takes something like that to, and it's really interesting that some people will take part in that, but they won't take part in an activity contest or whatever, because I think the word contest puts them off.
Yeah,
that's fine. So wouldn't it be fabulous if the same idea was 3 or 4 times a year on CW? Why not? And it probably takes a small group of people to say, yeah, we think this would be fun, and publicize it in a few weeks in advance. And I'm sure you'd generate some interesting activity. So maybe some options there.
I think that's very true, in the sense that another group that tends to do that particularly well are the SOTA guys, because they do activities related to specific bands, modes, etc., quite regularly. So taking a note from their book, should we say, it could well be an opportunity to do something from the CW side of things. And maybe 145 Alive, you could stretch it down to 144 Alive as well that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who knows who might turn up with a voice kit as opposed to a microphone.
Yeah.
But I mean, certainly from the point of view it's 145, I mean, things do seem to be, I would say, dead on a simplex basis around here. And the number of repeaters that have disappeared over a period of time are quite incredible. Same goes for 70 centimeters. Yeah, I think you mentioned about Echolink, and we're just struggling because we moved one of our nets onto an Echolink repeater, and of course, promptly
except it wasn't
exactly, the Echolink disappeared. But
I spent a couple of hours trying to log into that until I discovered it wasn't there anymore.
You weren't alone, Peter. You weren't alone. So, I mean, that's the conundrum that a lot of people find themselves with, in the sense that repeaters, all right, there seem to be quite a lot of them, but clustered in certain areas. And
if you think it's dead in the northwest, you want to come down here.
Yeah. I know.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm hearing that there's DMR networks and C4FM networks being set up on various repeaters, etc. Certainly up here, the Northwest Fusion Group seem to be doing quite a bit as far as that is concerned, and maybe that's the way things are going as far as.
Our local DMR repeater is about to be switched off because it never gets any use. Yeah, the one repeater that's very active down here is actually an amateur TV repeater, which is linked to the internet, has got multiple RF inputs on receive, and there's a lot of activity on that, amazingly.
Wow.
Justin, how did you go on with your meteor scatter?
Yeah, quite well, actually. Considering everybody was whining before on Thursday, Friday, that it wasn't a proper Perseid as every year. But well, I've not got that much comparison. I'm only doing it for a few years, so. But it seemed quite good on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. I worked from Thursday to yesterday. I worked 28 contacts.
That's good. Yeah.
Contacts. So
well done.
Anyway, I'm looking around the screen here. I think there's at least one non-VHF participant here, and I can see it's Bernard there. Have you got any comments to make, Bernard, about what you've heard tonight?
Yeah, okay, good evening. I actually enjoyed that session with my kind of CWHF hat on. And it was interesting to see the sorts of things that are going on and the new tools that are available. I find it a challenge to get on CW on HF, so whether I migrate to VHF, I don't know. All very interesting, thank you.
Is there anything that you might consider trying?
Yeah, I've been thinking about satellites recently, and all the shooting stars I had the last few days have kind of got me thinking about that.
I'm just trying to think. There is a little bit. Oscar 7, which has been around for years and years and years, has got a mode A, which is 2 meters up and 10 meters down, which you might find interesting to listen to, Bernard. I have a feeling it's not in mode A very much at the moment, but every now and again you get a season where every other day it's in mode A. And when I first started playing around with satellites, I actually, as a young G6, and you could do 2 meters up and it was 10 meters down, and it was quite good fun. So given that you've got some nice HF kit, that might be a place to start.
I think taking on what we've been doing at the club as well, because we've gone into QO100 by obtaining the various kits, but I treat QO100 as being like a mini HF band. Because at the end of the day, you've got CW, FD8, FD4, and of course SSB as well with the TV. So maybe from Bernard's point of view, all right, some of the low Earth orbit satellites are interesting getting into, should we say, but they're pure VHF. Maybe from your point of view, one of these dongles suitably attached might be a way into like something that you're probably already into anyway. Like I say, a mini HF band, and I'm sure the way Peter uses it. I mean, I think Peter, you use mostly what FD8 and FD4 and QO100.
Well, funny enough, I was just looking at that, and no, I'm on FT8 and FT4 a lot, and occasionally on CW, and there is a lot of CW on QO100. I've just been tuning around to see if I can hear any, and I can't at the moment. But most of my DXCCs on QO100 are on SSB for a very good reason, that the vast majority of activity on QO100 is on SSB, and certainly the DXpeditions, and then they switch to FT8 or whatever to add a lot of numbers. But I've got 100 and whatever it is. I can't remember whether it's 146 or 100, but whatever, 140 something DXCCs, and pretty much every one of those is on SSB and also on other modes. So it's actually the other way around. Just a quick comment on HF. Our local 2 meter repeater is sick at the moment, so our local club net last night, which is normally on the repeater, wasn't going to happen. So we decided to give it a go on 40 meters, and everybody that took part said what a fantastic net it was on 40 meters on SSB with QRM, and with it was obviously near vertical incidence stuff. So there was phase distortion. It was like talking to Radio Luxembourg, for those of you that are old enough to remember. So it was a real. We all said it was a real good, genuine radio night. So we're actually going to do it again next week.
Brilliant.
Yeah, we usually get that on 80 meters.
Yeah.
Same sort of characteristics.
Radio. Yeah, proper radio.
Real radio.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think we'll stretch to CW though.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we seem to be doing well on CW at 80 meters. That's a similar kind of idea, is it not, Bernard?
Exactly the same, really. And it's interesting that what condition change you do get on 80 meters. Yeah. In the length of an hour, you can all be 5 and 9 to being 3 and 3.
Yeah.
as experienced on Saturday. Yeah,
and the previous Wednesday.
absolutely. Evan, any other comments?
Just
You on the spot?
a question just on the with the satellites, particularly the linear ones. I mean, does the SDR make that easier to use? You know, for example, if you've got CW or SSB through a satellite, presumably you don't know exactly where stations are unless you do have an analyzer to help you.
Yeah, well, yeah, finding yourself on the linear satellites can sometimes be a bit of fun. It's not bad on QO 100 because it's sort of a fairly linear relationship, but on something like RS44, perhaps, which is a bit for it can be a bit more interesting to find yourself. So actually having an SDR and a panoramic display is quite nice because you can see when you press the key or whatever, you perhaps see you know, your signal pop up. So yeah, it can make it a little bit easier, I think. So that's quite nice. And
that would be better than being distracted listening to your voice come back. Would that be, as long as you can see a trace? That's the
yes, and you know, useful to particularly it helps you establish, you know, the Doppler shift and so on of where you are and when you're coming back, so that when you want to tune around the band and call somebody, you know where you need to call them. You know, is it sort of 5 kcs up or whatever?
Yeah. The inverted transponders are good fun as well, where when you go HF on transmit, you go LF on receive. They were always good fun.
Mm.
Oh, lower sideband, upper sideband.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I'm just wondering with the 7300 and that the 9700, does that sort of, can you load up the Keplerian elements and that tracks it for you? The Doppler shift, or
You can
done by PC?
You can control it from the PC with something like SAT PC32 or PST rotator, I think, will also do it. So you can computer control the rig and it'll work all. So you can just, you know, spin the VFO and it'll change your transmit to where it needs to be. So yeah, there's some nice stuff you can do there.
Can I just ask just a quick question on the linear satellites? I mean, if you say make a contact with someone on SSB, and do you tell the other station that you cat locked or anything like that to say that you're moving with it, or is it just guesswork where they are?
Well, you normally sort of have this little dance around that, you know, depending on how far away they are, you know, and how much Doppler they're getting, you'll sometimes find them shifting during the over, and you know, if it's I quite like working them on CW because you can just throw the odd dit in as you're listening to their over and just find out where you are, so that when, you know, they turn it back to you, you come back on the right frequency. It's a little bit harder on sideband, but yeah, by and large you sort of chase each other up and down the band a little bit, but it doesn't, you know, well, I was going to say you don't generally move that fast, and they've gone off air now, but there used to be a set of satellites called the XW satellites, and they XW2, and they were launched by the Chinese. They were quite a low orbit, but they were quite good fun, and you know, I used to work them on CW, and as they went directly overhead, the Doppler shift was really quite special, and you really did have to swing the VFO quite quickly to you know, to keep track of things. But when things are on the horizon a bit further away, it doesn't move that quickly. But yeah, you do quite a bit of chasing around.
Right. Okay.
There, Carsten, you were asking. No, it wasn't. It was. Don't know who it was actually. Just asking about tracking. Oh yes, I do. Right, I've remembered now. There's this thing here which I couldn't remember the name of. This is a development model, but it's a thing by a company called CSN Technologies. SAT, or it's called, I think. But basically, it's a non-PC thing which will track using the Yaesu Azel or lots of others, but using the Yaesu Azel rotator. Is it the 5300 or whatever?
Yeah.
This thing just running on a USB and plugs into the Yaesu connector, wherever it is. There we go. And that will do all your tracking for you in real time.
That's nice.
And this was a development one, but I think they're about $100 or something. And it just sits there. When it's plugged in, the readout tells you the elevation and azimuth and all sorts of stuff, and it just works. But otherwise, there are a million other software versions that will do the same job.
Mm.
There is a guy in the States who produced a cheat sheet in terms of the various frequencies that you should be tuning.
That's right. Yes.
And that is very handy.
K
gives you an
K0HBR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also another chap over there. I'm trying to remember his surname, but a chap by the name of Sean. Is it Sean Kutzko?
Yeah.
He produces some very interesting YouTube videos about working satellites, both FM and also some of the linear ones as well. And it is quite interesting, you know, where they're using double FT817s or 818s, and that's quite an interesting way of working them, especially you're out in the open, because obviously everything's handheld. But in these kind of circumstances, you can always do it with about 3 sets of arms to control everything. Yeah. A problem that I had, even just working with one radio and one antenna, you know, you think, how am I gonna log from here, like, you know?
Hope you've got a good memory.
Hence the voice recorder, you know. So that's always a useful thing. But it's an interesting side of things to get into, and I know the satellites are very popular, especially the ISS one. If you can get into that, you're doing well.
Yeah, and of course there have been some astronauts appeared on
absolutely,
that.
yes, that's the interesting one, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, where all of a sudden they pick up the mic and start chatting. Yeah,
it's good fun.
All right, any other comments, Bernard?
No, other than thank you, I've enjoyed it.
Right, all right. Any other comments we haven't heard from Roy? Anything you want to say?
Not from me, no. Very interesting on the 2 meter and 77s. Thanks, Tim.
Sure.
Brilliant. All right. Okay. Well, I think it's getting up to Cocoa time, certainly as far as a few viewers are concerned. I think the best thing we do is say thank you very much indeed, Tim. Very interesting that tonight.
Yeah.
As usual, and thank you very much for taking the time out to come and chat to us. Thank you everyone for joining in. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And as perhaps we better let Tony and Nigel finish up.
Very interesting. Thanks very much indeed for taking the time out to come join SRS for your talk.
Thank you.
Good man. So with
Thanks,
that,
thanks,
thank
Tim.
you very much.
Yeah, good to see you all.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
See you on 6.